All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're at. I still got a little morning left in some of these areas. So, welcome to Corteva's webinar series, Soil and Fertility and Pasture Management. My name's Sam Ingram. I'm a field scientist from the Eastern U.S. for our Range and Pasture division of the company. I'll be speaking with you today, and also with me here is Benny Martinez, and I'll let Benny introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So my name is Benny Martinez. I actually serve in the southwest, western part of the U.S., and my role is a market development specialist. And so I often work with Sam, but also work with our local team members. So glad to have you all today.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for joining. We've got close to 100 folks, and really appreciate your time today. And hopefully, you're going to be able to get some good nuggets of knowledge to take into it related to soil fertility and pasture management. So on the next slide, we'll just give a brief note to the audience to say, this discussion around fertility, it's basic in its nature. It's not meant to be a specific recommendation. I think what the goal here is for at least the first portion of the talk is to get you thinking about one or two things that might make sense on your operation, or if you're running a business, say with fertilizer, to get you thinking about a couple of things for the farmer and rancher for them to be considering in this year. And just like the case with a lot of management decisions that you all have, is there's variability in where you place them and whether you push the green light to go on some of these management considerations or not. It depends on the region. And then lastly, we want to consult our local experts because they're going to know the way to push forward on some things like this with soil fertility. And that could be definitely our range and pasture specialists. They're located across the U.S. I think they're a great local trusted expert for you. You think about extension agents, your state forage specialist, or even the agronomist at your local co-op, and some of those leading farmers, ranchers that are doing some things in your area that are kind of pushing the needle and really maximizing production. I think all of those folks would be good to consult with as you think about management strategies to put in on your place. All right, on the next slide for the agenda, we'll talk about one. Hopefully, you already know the importance of this, but we'll maybe do a little refresh on why we're going to sample, why to test your soil, the proper soil sampling techniques. Talk about fertility basics, focusing in on the macronutrients, but we'll hit on some other wells as well. And then lastly, Benny's going to spend some time on UltiGraz, which is a solution provided by Corteva where we're combining a lot of the things we're talking about today, the soil fertility aspect of fertilization, and then also the weed control. So diving right into it, why sample and test your soil? For us on the East Coast and a lot across the U.S., we think about some of these improved forage varieties. They've been bred for tonnage, for yield, and they've been bred for quality. But if we're not putting down the adequate amounts of nutrients, then we're never going to reap the benefits of those forages. And then when you think about feed cost for our operations, they're going to be the highest point of cost for getting our animals across the board. And then on the flip side, the cheapest way to keep those animals at a maintenance or a growth stage, depending on whether it's lactation or growth, is through forages. So really, it makes sense. We want to maximize those forages that we already have on farm, and the way we're gonna do that, or one of those limiting factors, could be soil nutrients. So we're testing the soil to make sure, hey, is my NP and K right for us to maximize production, to keep feed costs low, to put more money in the pocket when you start thinking about that. Another thing, other than I think a broad brush stroke, is unless you test, it's just a guess. That's what I've heard a lot from extension folks over the years, and I believe that is true. So there's a lot of ranges of fertility and pH, and obviously those are going to impact the forage quality and the tonnage produced. So really, the test gives us numbers to leverage and put back into what we want to do. The other things you can think about, we'll hit on pH, we'll hit on cation exchange capacity, but those nutrients, even if we have them out there, if we don't have certain things like pH and know what our cation exchange capacity is, we could be over applying, and that's costly. Lastly, the take home message would probably be the balanced nutrition ensures optimum production. And we'll talk about how to find that balance through a soil test. Okay, so this cartoon, if you haven't seen it, I don't know. I think this one's in practically every formal education study of soils or and webinars like this. Liebig's law of minimum with a barrel overflowing, and really it's just to create that picture in your mind of the scarcest resource that's not available will hinder us from a production standpoint. This is true for plants. This is true for even population growth. As you look at overall time when we've had more availability of proteins or whatever have you, our builds of our bodies we're taller and we have more muscles, all that good stuff. So it applies to not only humans but also plants. And soil tests, really help us identify what's that limiting scarcest nutrient. We hit on this too, but as you think about it, the law of minimums demonstrates that if we're putting out the wrong nutrient, it could hurt us on yield, but also a profit loss, because one, we may not be realizing the maximum where it plateaus for forage production, but two, we could just be over applying. And as I've talked to fertilizer dealers, I've heard that supply is their words were firm. So it's not cheap. It's not a cheap river that you're going in after. So we want to make sure that's right. When we talk about general soil sampling guidelines, proper depth for the majority of cases that we all are going to be in, 0 to 6 inches is going to be sufficient for us to do that. One call out here is going to be the very top plant material, some of those roots and organic matter there. We're going to discard that so we have a representative sample. When you think about how many samples we need to take, more is better because we get a better average, but say 15 to 20 cores is going to be needed for that representative sample. The other thing we can keep in mind is when we're collecting based on forage removal, pastures, we're probably not going to need it every year. Some folks do go after that if they're trying to mitigate a certain area to transition, maybe some troubled areas. They might take those samples every year, but usually we're saying around every 3 years. Now, for pastures, for hay fields, we have it here as hay pastures. That's going to be annual because we're removing those nutrients every year when that bale of hay rolls off that hay field. We're taking nutrients with it, so we need to be sampling every year to make sure that we're putting those nutrients back in place, because otherwise yield's going to go down, stand viability is going to go down, and we're going to run into some train wrecks. And then the last thing that you want to do to kind of reduce the noise is get on a schedule and stay on that schedule, whether it be time of year when you're wanting to sample, because those nutrients that are available in the soil can change with weather, depending on what's growing in that season. You think about it from an availability standpoint of those nutrients, it changes throughout the year. So stay consistent with it, and over time you'll have a better look, a true look at how are my soils changing. All right, so how to sample, getting into the details of that. Tools for collection. Here, clean non-metallic bucket that we would want that. Mine would be non-metallic because there's minerals in those type of metallic containing buckets. So that could alter our sample. So usually 5-gallon plastic bucket that you can purchase anywhere, a hardware store, or if you've recently painted the house, clean one of those buckets out, and that turns into your soil sample bucket. The other thing, some of these soil probes, depending on where you're located and what you have access to, a lot of your agronomists at the co-op could potentially come out and pull those soil samples for you. And a lot of our local extension county agents, they have soil probes in their office that you could borrow and utilize there. and it's not too much to say it might be a good investment. I'm sure a lot of folks have tractors or UTVs that are several $1,000s in purchase price. When you think about a soil probe being $100, that's a small investment to really capture a lot of data on your farm that's going to help potentially maximize production and decrease cost, because we're really honing in on what nutrients we need. The other thing not listed here, but one that you might want to do when we talk about removing some of those organic matter in the soils, you might want to get a ladle that has the holes in it, like it's just really a sieve to sieve out some of that plant material or rocks that you don't want to have in that sample. Now, I would recommend, if you steal that from the kitchen, you probably need to replace that one with a new one. I would suggest putting that back in the drawer. You might get some ugly looks when you're trying to serve food with one of those that you had out in the field. But definitely a good tool to have in the toolbox there. All right, and then hitting on this again, it's good to hear it. 15 to 20 core samples per area. We're going to look at a cartoon here to show you kind of what the pattern looks like and minimum acres to sample. But 15 to 20 is going to give you a good representative number, good average of those areas. We're going to combine all those samples in that 5-gallon bucket, pull out the plant material, maybe crush it a little bit, get a good uniform sample, and then we're going to fill the bag and label it appropriately. So again, it's all depending on where you want to go with the sample, but you may already have sample bags from your lab. If nothing else, you can put it in a Ziploc, make sure you're labeling it to something that makes sense to you, so we can track that back if the lab has any questions. Because the last thing you want to do is get a sample to the lab, they can't read it, or they have issues with certain samples. We want to make sure we can track it back to a certain field to let them know with confidence that was field 3A that we're looking at. All right, so University of Missouri Extension here with this cartoon. A couple of things to call out. The first is just the pattern of taking those 15 to 20 core samples. The pattern that I do, and I'm sure most of you do too, you can do it on foot or you can do it with a UTV, whichever one you prefer. But we want to do them in a random mix of that acres that we're going to sample. You can see here somewhere 15 to 20 acres or less to be maximized on that acre. But what we're trying to do here is just make sure we're capturing the whole look of that paddock or pasture. And we don't want to focus in on the reason why we do the zigzag pattern and more of a random approach is we don't want to focus in on one area and leave out another, because we want a good representative sample, and that's done with that pattern. Some of the areas we're going to want to avoid is going to be those heavy use areas, like a hay feeding area, some of the waters, artificial shade structures, or the naturals like the trees where animals congregate. We're going to be depositing urine, feces, and that's where nutrients are going to be there. So it's not going to give us an accurate look at it. The other thing, said here, avoid sampling near limestone roads because of runoff. That can give you a false sense of security with something like a pH or cation exchange capacity. So we want to avoid some of those things. All right, so what to do with a sample? Now we've got to this point, we want to make sure that first bullet point here, probably the most important, you want to send it to a lab that is experienced in your area, knows what you're dealing with on that regional basis, but also one that they don't have to specialize in forages, but hopefully they have a good understanding. We're not going to send it to, say, an environmental lab or one that they say they can do the samples, but they're not as familiar with it. Majority of you probably working with university labs or some private labs that are somewhat local to your area won't have that issue, but something to call out for sure. And another thing to remember, we don't have an example listed here because they just differ so much from lab to lab. But remember, when you're looking at that test, it's presenting most times available nutrients, not the total content from that soil sample. So that's something to keep in mind as we're making those recommendations. And then lastly, we went through all this trouble to get the soil samples, make sure they're accurate and representative of the field. Leverage the results as a tool. Don't just put them away and say, hey, I've done it for the year. Check that box with the chore of soil sampling. make sure that we're utilizing that when we're talking to our agronomists, when we're making decisions on what fertility to put out. And the last point here that, soil sampling in some instances don't want to create any bitterness, but, some places you can get them for free with university, depending on the county location. Some are, under $10, some $6. I remember it used to be the price, maybe moved up now to 8 or 10. They're relatively cheap. But what is not cheap is guessing and over applying, which what we talked about there, Leibniz's law, the minimum. What we'll discuss here with cow exchange capacity. Those tests are relatively cheap. Invest that money so we can make good decisions based on the data that comes back. All right, so interpreting that soil test, just as I mentioned, we didn't go into an example because they vary the way a lot of folks present soil sample results. But one thing you should consider, I would think, is to utilize either your local agronomist, whether that be university or there at the co-op or the fertilizer supplier. They're well versed in a lot of those samples that come in, and they can give you good parameters or best knowledge of here's your options based on what we've done in the past. You can see here too. We call out for another time. They can be complex. They can be overwhelming. Sometimes they're presented in units that I'm not always familiar with, that we don't see day to day. That's where these local experts can come into play. And for sure, calling out our state and county extension service, whether it be your local county agent or the state forage specialist, folks that understand it. All right, moving over to macronutrient availability and looking at soil pH. And just a reminder here, one thing I forgot to mention earlier on, utilize, if you have questions, because we definitely want to keep this an open dialogue and discussion. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A instead of the chat. That way we can capture the specific questions. We can answer from there too. But if we don't get to them or we need to follow up with you, we'll have the information needed to follow back up with you. So if you all don't mind, just use that Q&A when you have a question. All right, so jumping into pH, as you think about pH and when we focus in on forages, pH it comes to a big factor. Whether we can spend all the time on capturing what our phosphorus and potassium needs are going to be. We can say, hey, I want to produce 4 tons per acre of X amount of grass, and we know how much nitrogen we want to put out there. But if we don't have our pH right, that could all be of waste. So this little graph here that shows pH, we won't put this in the Q&A. You don't have to answer this here, but you can maybe put it in the chat or just think about it. Okay, so what would be the optimal pH, you think, for our forage grasses that we're coming across that we utilize in a lot of our livestock systems? Is it closer up to that seven range, or is it closer here to where actually it's at 6.5? That's actually going to be our optimal right there in that 6 to 6.5 pH for our forage grasses. You can see for the nutrient uptake. So as you walk down there, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this graph here, but as we move, as we shift the needle on pH in our soils, we can see that even if we have it out there, what are those forage grasses going to be able to take up? As we get closer to a neutral, a lot of those become more available. For those forage grasses is somewhere in that 6.5. As we think about legumes, it's actually closer to that neutral, that 7.5. So a big thing to keep in mind, that's why we lead off here with it first, getting that pH right is going to be important. The other thing to talk about is cation exchange capacity. So this one, as you think about it, and a good visual that Benny and I talked about, that Benny was talking with me, is a good explanation. If you've got a 5-gallon bucket, and that's say that's your soils, and you want to put nitrogen into the soil, the total amount of nitrogen that soil can hold, its capacity to hold the nitrogen, to take it in, for then to allow root absorption, root uptake, plant uptake, is going to be 5 gallons. That's what you're maxed out at. Okay, if we have 20 gallons of nitrogen or 10 gallons of nitrogen, we try to put it in that bucket, it's going to spill over, right? So even if we want to put more nitrogen in the system, it's not able to take it up within that soil and then move over to plant uptake. Probably a crude representation explanation of cation exchange capacity, but hopefully it tells you, even if we want to dump as much nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, whatever have you, into the system, at some point we're going to go in excess. How do we know what that point is? Back to soil sampling, back to those tests. All right, so we're not going to walk down through every one of these, but when we think about CEC, cation exchange capacity, big things to call out here. Higher cation exchange capacity is going to be a good thing for us. When we think about clay soils and the size of their surface area compared to, say, silt or sand, it's much smaller, so they have more cation exchange sites. So we're going to have a higher cation exchange capacity in general for those compared to sandy soils, silt soils, and then organic matter. That's where we're really going to have that higher cation exchange capacity. One of the foundations is building organic matter, building fertility. That's one of the big reasons in my mind to have higher organic matter. If we want to walk through an example, we can do that. Well, let's call it these general ranges. It's expressed in milliequivalents per 100 grams. So then it's just going to give you a number. And for cation exchange capacity, they rate 10 or lower as low. Medium would be 15. High would be in excess of 20. Okay, and then a general rule here for holding capacity for nitrogen, the CEC rule is CEC times 10. So this example is, say we've got a cation exchange capacity of 20. So that would be on the high range. 20 times 10 is 200. So this soil has the capacity to hold approximately 200 pounds of nitrogen. That's important because as we're thinking about fertility requirements, how far in do we want to go? We know that we can go 200, and we wouldn't go over. All right, so jumping into the macronutrients and some of these secondary nutrients. When we think about soil fertility, we've got 16 elements that we were going to cover that are needed for normal growth. Some of those that maybe we don't think about all the time when we're talking about soil fertility. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, those are the non-mineral elements, and they're used the most as we think about the processes of plants growing. The other 13 that we focus in on, they're usually applied or are recycled through the animals through harvesting of the forages and sometimes the forage, all those plants that we can get back into the system goes back into it. A lot of times they could be applied. Macronutrients we're going to focus in on, N, P, and K, the big ones. You think about nitrogen up, phosphorus down, potassium all around when it comes to plant growth and overall health. 3 secondary nutrients we're going to call out: calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. So as we look at the first one, on that next slide, you think about nitrogen. Big one here. One that when we test, you've all noticed it too, is nitrogen. It's not gonna show up on a lot of our tests unless we specifically call it out, because it's just a moving target. Because of the way, depending on the system that you have in place, time of year, nitrogen can be a moving target. That's usually just a recommendation that folks make based on what the crop is. So if it's tall fescue, or if it's Bermuda grass or some other type of forage, what do you want to achieve as far as tonnage? Here's our recommendation for that. It's one of the most limiting nutrients in non-legume crops. So, legumes have a benefit of fixating their own nitrogen. It's a huge component in chlorophyll, which is necessary for photosynthesis for overall plant growth. Some of the things that can hold us back, so situations where we might find deficiency, obviously oversaturated soils, can't have that uptake. Flooded or ponded soil, when you think about some of these bogs, there's actually denitrification happening in environmental areas where they want those bogs. Dry and sandy soils, definitely during colder soils that, right now, nitrogen uptake availability is not going to be heavy. Or if we get a heavy rainfall where it's leached off plants, it's not going to be available to them. Some of the things that we might see out in the field beyond just overall poor yield, because we need that response for yield. Pale yellow. We got a little picture here that we can see chlorosis, overall stunting, slow growth, and in some cases, whether if it's severe, overall necrosis. So not just yellowing, but overall just death of those plants, leaf tips and margins that die back. That will probably get you some phone calls to say, hey, something's happening here. Again, a benefit of having some of those soil tests, we can rule out some of these things. All right, next one on the phosphorus. So, nitrogen up. When we focus in on nitrogen, it's going to be mostly above ground. Phosphorus, I would say, down. A lot to deal with overall root system. So some of the call outs here: energy storage and transfer. So how is that plant moving those things throughout the plant? Phosphorus is going to be helpful for that. Respiration promotes early root growth. So when we're thinking about getting established, phosphorus is going to be a big deal there. And then overall seed formation, that plant is wanting to put on seed to go back into the seed bank to help us maintain a vigorous sod cover. That's going to be a big key there too. Situation where we might have phosphorus deficiency, again, cold soils and compacted soils. Similar symptoms that you might think of. Well, we just talked about stunted growth, slow growth. That's what we just talked about with nitrogen. A little different there with overall stunted growth happening because of, say, root depletion, because we're not able to go out and scavenge for those nutrients, for that moisture, because of overall poor root growth. So it's going to be a little different, but gets to the same end of, man, this grass is just not growing like it should. And here, just to call out the thing, healthy roots equal healthy and productive forages. Phosphorus plays a huge part in that. All right, potassium. This is a big one for sure that we see. At least when you think about overall stand loss or stand deterioration, when we start seeing thinning of grasses, potassium, we can sometimes come back to this one. One that we get a lot of calls on. Maybe we're low potassium. So overall, it's very important to have the potassium levels at accurate and adequate levels, because opening and closing the leaf pores. When you think about the exchange overall growth, that's huge. Photosynthesis, all the things that we can call out here: carbohydrate translocation, protein synthesis. So you think about overall forage quality. Similar situations where we can have potassium deficiencies: dry soils, wet soils, those sandier soils where those nutrients are moving out, where we don't have, say, a clay or silt, higher organic matter, where the leaching is higher. Even overall higher organic matter where it's tied up, and then compaction. Potassium deficiencies, focusing in on grass, slow growth of forage. Overall, plants, you start seeing thinning out, especially in hay fields where folks aren't putting back potassium that they're taking off with that hay crop. I will say a lot of times we'll get calls and confusion on maybe some insect pressure, or we're losing the stand loss to a herbicide application. Sometimes this is tracked back to fertility, and a lot of times I've seen it in instances with potassium. I call it here with a legume, alfalfa on that side. Small whitish gray leaf margins indicates potassium deficiency, dry leaves, overall leaf drop, and that can be a huge deal, especially in the alfalfa market when we're trying to maintain and retain that leaf when we're putting it up in a hay system. All right, so quickly I'll go through some secondary nutrients. As we think about magnesium, and we think about overall for pH, when we think about magnesium, calcium, having those overall numbers are going to be central and important for us to maintain that 6.5. So it's part of the central components in chlorophyll. You think about respirations, transportation of phosphorus. One thing we didn't really call out is the phosphorus absorption. In some instances, phosphorus is not as readily available as some of these other nutrients. Magnesium plays a huge part in actually moving that phosphorus. So that's a key thing where they, it's not just one standalone, they all interworking there. Magnesium with phosphorus is a good call out to show that. When we have lower cation exchange capacity, that could be an issue for us. Low to moderate pH, lower soil temperatures, higher permeable soils with excessive moisture, all those things where we could run into some issues with magnesium. That could be the case. And on the next one with calcium, as we think about calcium for sure in legumes, but also in forage grasses, big component for us as you think about uptake and activity of other nutrients overall. That has a big impact on movement, uptake, and activity of those other nutrients, all kind of combined. Stimulates root and leaf development. So obviously those are going to be important not only for when we're thinking about establishing a stand or keeping a stand when it has adverse conditions, whether it be drought, but also for leaf development. When we're thinking about yield, leaf to shoot ratio, we want more of a leaf for higher quality. Those things come into play. Some situations where we can have deficiencies, very low soil pH. So we know we didn't talk about liming, but specific limes, high cal lime. When we get some of these soil samples back and we have our calcium numbers, it'll help us identify, hey, types of lime don't make, what do we need? So it can be very important there. And then the interaction, so soils high with K and magnesium, when we're talking about binding sites, soils only have so many. We can have that where some of those sites are already filled up with potassium and magnesium. All right, and lastly, we'll talk about sulfur. One neat thing, a lot of times when folks put out, let's say, ammonium sulfate or they'll add in straight sulfur too on some of these, it can help us with situations like the yellowing in the forage. That is because of chlorophyll formation. We need that for that chlorophyll formation and the green color aids in seed production. So although we're talking mostly about perennial grass stands, when those plants produce seeds, put them back into the seed bank, they're filling in some of those gaps where we need new plants to come in. So it's important there. And then on the legume side, it helps with that nodulation for plants for those legumes to produce their own nitrogen. So that's a big key here too. Sulfur deficiency, acidic, sandier soils, some of those soils low in organic matter. We kind of talked about the importance of organic matter, highly eroded soils, and then some of those no-till fields. All right, just to wrap up on my end, hopefully this is just a refresh. I'm sure a lot of you this is kind of potentially top of mind already in the season we're in, and we're getting ready for to take advantage maybe with some of these cold seasons, the spring forage bump or warm season grasses they're going to be coming out here pretty quick to produce for us. As we think about the importance of soil fertility, we're going to maximize the growth of those improved forages that we have on our land. It's the cheapest way for us to maintain animals and put growth, whether it be lactation or true growth on some of these other animals. And the way we do that is through soil testing. You got to come up with a plan, get the results, leverage those to make the best informed decisions, because overall that's protecting your investment. All right, and then now I'll turn it over to Benny Martinez to talk about UltiGraz, and I think this dovetails into a great way to really talk about fertility, combining fertility and herbicide. So Benny, I'll turn it over to you.
Sam. Can you verify that you can hear me okay?
Yep, got you, Benny.
Perfect. Well, one thing that we may have forgotten on the front end of the presentation that I wanted to make sure that we covered is we are going to utilize the Q&A on the Zoom. If you have any questions, please place those questions in the Q&A and not the chat. We'll try to address those questions as best as possible. But the other thing that we'll be able to do is, if we don't get to your questions because of time, we'll certainly try to respond to you in other forms to get an answer to your question. So please use that quick Q&A to ask any questions that you may have. So we're going to be talking about UltiGraz and what it means and what it is. Really rethink of UltiGraz as probably one of the most successful technological advancements in pasture management. It gives the producer peace of mind that when they're investing, they're obviously investing in fertility. Fertility is not cheap. We want to maximize our grass growth. Leverage the nutrients that funnel those nutrients all to forage production. We've got to think about controlling those weeds, and this system approach in UltiGraz gives us that opportunity. It leverages a network of fertilizer retailers and applicators, custom applicators that are certified in the process, and we certify them to ensure that they're going to deliver a high quality product to you. We want to ensure that they're doing it right. They're doing it with the proper equipment. That they're doing it with certain key considerations. That way, when you get a product, it's up to the standards that we want, and that's why we have this elite group of individuals that are what we call certified UltiGraz dealers. You'll receive a herbicide recommendation that's often customized with a proper rate that's specific to your area. And that's really important because, these folks have some experience, with UltiGraz, and they've already been through some of the challenges and some of the ahas, if you will. Hey, maybe for this area, maybe this rate works better than that rate, and so on and so forth. So they really have it buttoned down when it comes to having a good process. UltiGraz Pasture Weed Feed really offers a really convenient one pass, saving you a trip in application cost. You can actually apply this yourself if you have your own equipment. We do ask that this is dedicated equipment to pastures only, and this is from a stewardship standpoint. If for some reason, maybe by chance, you don't have a dry supplier and you have a liquid supplier, you can utilize the same concept with DuraCore. For example, DuraCore actually mixes very well with liquid UAN, even when temperatures are really cold, where you could see a lot of antagonism with a 2,4-D base type product that's labeled. And we'll talk about labeling here in a second as well. So this is just an example of what it could look like. Sometimes these UltiGraz dealers will actually incorporate a dye into the process, and this helps identify that the product has been treated with a herbicide. This is extremely important, obviously, to ensure that one, you know what you're dealing with. You're getting something extra and not just fertility. And so this is just a way to delineate. In states where permitted, so every single state is a little different. So you want to ensure that your state has an approval for the products that you can use for the UltiGraz system. The retailer will basically apply the herbicide to the fertilizer prills during the blending process. And again, they're set up with proper equipment. We'll give some examples of what that equipment may look like. But it's very specific. It's not just pouring it out of a jug and placing it on the fertilizer. There is a process here. Now we are dependent on rain in this format of controlling weeds because most of the activity is going to come from soil residual activity. So we're dependent on the rain to move that herbicide with the fertilizer into the soil so that it can be taken up through the roots of the targeted weeds. This is just a picture, an illustration of some equipment that could potentially be used. This is a vertical blender on the left, on the right as well, with that's set up with what we call an impregnation ring, and that ring sprays the fertilizer in a consistent manner as the fertilizer is getting blended in this vertical blender. Okay, so DuraCore herbicide is a soil active herbicide. This is really key to making sure that this process works. Without that, you really don't have an opportunity for really robust control. So with DuraCore, we have both pre-emerge and post-emerge control. And so you do have the best of both worlds with Duracore because of that factor. Our typical expectations with a UltiGraz application in terms of overall control tends to be lower than what of a foliar application. And that's really driven by the fact that we just get more effective coverage with a broadcast foliar application than we do with a dry application. So just imagine, the fertilizer prills getting spread out, and this one little weed that may be trying to germinate that's in an area that what doesn't have a prill that made it to that area. And that's why we see what we see with control. But it's generally 70 to 80%. I think it's actually higher than that. But at the end of the day, I think it's important to have your expectations built correctly when you're using the UltiGraz system. It's good. It's not as good as a foliar application, but at the end of the day, it really helps combine two applications in one and ensures that you're not going to get weeds that are capitalized. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So how to apply. We're going to utilize spreader trucks or fertilizer buggies to apply this dry product as we would normally do. And so it's really no different than what we're used to doing with dry fertilizer spreaders. Again, we're dependent on that rainfall to move that herbicide into the soil profile so that those roots can actively absorb that herbicide through the roots and be affected by that herbicide. Weed control is almost entirely dependent on the soil residual activity, but there is, like I mentioned, some post activity that we see out of the UltiGraz system. And I'll share a picture of an example of that. So the benefits of impregnated fertilizer, obviously there's a time-saving component there. If we're making two applications in one, instead of making a separate application, we're obviously reducing that to one trip. Fewer weather delays and reduced risk of drift. What we mean by that is, obviously we need to be sensitive when we're making foliar applications to those windy days. Well, because we're applying a dry product, we're not nearly as susceptible to drift with this concept as we are to a foliar application. No spray equipment needed. Self-application is definitely possible. A lot of times we get into binds with commercial applicators, and I feel sorry for them because obviously they get a earful when people are on them to get to them in a timely manner, maybe before that rain event comes. Well, this gives you the opportunity to maybe self-apply and do it yourself, and not have to wait on a applicator that may be backlogged because he has experienced some delays related to weather. If it's a large or small operations, really doesn't matter. I've seen these applications go out on some fairly sizable places. It just depends on what your situation is, but it is a tool in the toolbox, and that's the most important thing to remember here. So this is a picture of a post-treatment application, and so you can actually see the fertilizer prills that are kind of scattered here. I do apologize. For some reason, the circles have kind of moved around on us on the pictures, but you can see some prills that have actually landed on that thistle plant that you see kind of in the center there. And those are obviously prills that are going to be absorbed. That herbicide is actually going to be absorbed in the leaf in this example, versus the ones that you see in the soil that actually made it to the soil are actually going to be more reliant on that root uptake. And so if you can look, you can see some of those smaller weeds that may not have a prill that's relatively close to it. And that weed may take longer for it to actually intercept some of that herbicide. So that's just a good visual effect of that process there. So in the picture to the right, you can see that same thistle was controlled, and it could have been largely due to the soil residual activity, but it also could have been also due to the post activity that we're seeing from those prills actually landing on that plant. We do have some interception that takes place if there's enough crevices on that plant structure to retain some of those prills. Well, you're going to get that advantage that you're going to get some post-emerge activity from that application. And there's just a circle of that. This is a picture of a field that was actually treated with Durcor with the UltiGraz process. This was applied back in 2003. 7 weeks after application, they used 18 ounces. This was in Hutchinson, Kansas. And so what you can see is a swath there. You'll see it kind of center. You'll see it basically untreated on the right, treated on the left. If you look closely, you can see that there's a significant difference in the weed pressure. You can see a thistle that's kind of controlled, that's close to us, versus the one that's on the right that's not controlled. So pretty significant, pressure here. A lot of weed pressure, and I'll say it's actually pretty good control. I would base this one just visually. I would say that it's 80% plus. So at the end of the day, weeds don't only starve our forages from the nutrients that they need, but they also serve as a grazing avoidance. So when animals are grazing, especially thistles are prickly. Anything that's prickly will cause a grazing avoidance. And so there's two things that are going on here. One of the things that we're seeing is that we're seeing a lack of forage utilization. We're really limiting the amount of grazable acres that we have when we have a situation where we have, infestation of weeds, particularly the ones that cause grazing avoidance. And a lot of them do that for a variety of reasons. Some weeds are poisonous. Cattle know that they're poisonous, so they're not naturally not going to graze to that. But some of them are prickly and cause some irritation when they're grazing close. And so the take-home message here is, control those weeds, maximize your grazing efficiency, grow more grass, ensure that your investment is going into the production of a forage that your animals can actually utilize, and not something that they're just not going to utilize. That's going to result in a lower return on investment because it's going to feed weeds and not grass growth. So this was actually a study that was done by Mississippi State University. And there's been studies that have been done, across the board, across the United States, that show the same exact trend. So what this is showing, the differences in forage production and the forage response for a given practice. So in the very top one, that's the check. That's not doing anything at all. So you can see that in this example, not doing anything at all, we grew 1,893 pounds of weeds and 830 pounds of grass. Well, the end result, because we didn't implement a management technique, there was no net grass production from this exercise. In the next one, we see fertilizer only. And this one was really surprising. I've seen where we do grow more weeds and more grass, but in this example, we actually had a reduction in overall production. And it may be because everything was competing against each other and not really allowing for a true response from the fertility, as this example shows from this trial. When they implemented a herbicide only and no fertility, we actually grew an extra 1,090 pounds of grass over the untreated. That's pretty significant. So we've always known that, a return on investment is really good, for fertilizer and a herbicide. But this just really shows you a good example where just the herbicide by itself really contributes to a really positive result in terms of forage response. And then last but not least, the herbicide with the fertilizer. So we're talking about an UltiGraz type of system. We grew an extra 2,000 pounds of grass. We did grow a few more weeds than the herbicide alone, because we're stimulating both. But at the end of the day, you can see obviously a tremendous response in terms of forage response. And that all equals to, the herbicide use only as a 131% gain in terms of forage response. And then when we look at both the fertilizer and the herbicide in an UltiGraz system, that's a 250% increase. You can see how we came with the math. We're all tying the incremental growth of grass that we grew with those situations, and then tying it back to that control check as a calculation. So some stewardship guidelines as it relates to the use of the UltiGraz system and the use of Durcor. Durcor herbicide doesn't have any grazing restrictions, and that includes all classes of livestock, including lactating dairy cows, horses, lactating mares, meat animals prior to slaughter. So it's got a, it's fairly flexible from that perspective. One of the things that I will caution people on is the fact that we want to ensure that we're utilizing dedicated equipment. We're reading the label. If we're using this system, we want to ensure that we're not rotating animals that have been foraging on those forages unless we have a 3-day withdrawal. So we want to move them to an untreated pasture and then move them to a sensitive crop. If we wanted to graze, let's say alfalfa, we would want a clean out period there in order for us to stay safe. The utilization of manure in those areas is also is something that we want to be cognizant of, because that manure is going to contain that herbicide. And so we don't want to use manure from those sites for a vegetable garden, for example. You're not going to have a lot of success growing a vegetable garden if you're utilizing manure from that. As always, consult the label for additional details. We want to use dedicated equipment because, again, we have a residual product that's being utilized here. We want to keep this equipment on sites where we have a labeled use. And we want to keep it away from those sensitive crops or other non-labeled sites, from it potentially getting to those sites that we just don't have a label for. And we can potentially get into a situation where we're at risk of hurting something that we don't want to hurt. So just to wrap things up, there are a variety of benefits here. Obviously, for better forage production, doing fertility and weed control all in one has some significant benefits. There's a cost and time-saving component, obviously, to that, because we're able to make that application in one trip. And we're funneling those resources to grow in forage and not weeds. There's application flexibility. You don't have to worry about a drift because we're applying a dry product, and that certainly opens the opportunity for some greater flexibility. Simple and convenient. These guys are well versed. We've spent a lot of time and effort putting together some materials to help these UltiGraz dealers become the best of their ability, so that they can deliver a quality product at the end of the day. At the end of the day, we don't want to fertilize weeds. We want to fertilize grass. That's where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck. You've seen the chart there with that Mississippi State trial. It's a no-brainer. We don't want to feed weeds. It's not a sustainable option there for you. So I think we do have just a few minutes for some questions. I think I'm showing about 7 minutes here. So we're going to take some questions. I'm going to rely on Sam and some of the other Corteva folks to maybe look at the Q&A and let Sam and I know what those questions are, so that we can get those covered. The last slide, I'll tell you, is just a closing slide. At the end of the day, if you have any other questions that we maybe didn't answer as it relates to UltiGraz, you can scan that QR code on the bottom right, and that's going to take you to our UltiGraz webpage, where you can actually find a UltiGraz dealer. So it's a really convenient spot where you can actually plug your site in and an address, and it's going to give you a list of all of the UltiGraz dealers that are close to your area. And so it's a pretty handy spot for you to get some additional information as it relates to UltiGraz. So I'll go ahead and open it up to questions. I'll let the team ask the questions.
Yeah, great job, Ben. We got a couple of them coming in, a couple of them answered. One that I'll take off the top. We had a question come in from California, and Laura did a good job answering that. I will say, they asked how hard is it on legumes and pastures, and it's going to be Durcor in general is very good on those legumes, so we do a good job controlling. It's got the residual activity, and that's why it's a really good fit for UltiGraz. So on that, we would have it. Another person asked, which university did the forage response, and I believe they're referring to that Mississippi State table that you were talking about. Let's see here. You answered it there, but just to call out again, where can folks find if UltiGraz is available to them? That's on ultigraz.com, right, Benny?
Yeah, that's correct. They can again scan this QR code. It's going to take them directly to the UltiGraz website. That's going to have a dealer finder for them. But they can also go to rangeandpasture.com for a variety of our products and services that they can look at, and they can also find their local representative in their area through the rangeandpasture.com website.
Two really good websites, at rangeandpasture.com. It'll give you a lot of general, like Benny said, and then UltiGraz will send you directly to them. One person asked, is a blender the only way to impregnate? And that's our most common way that is done. Although we do have folks retrofitting 8-ton tender wagons out of the auger. Those specific folks doing it that way, where they're putting the herbicide on the prill as it's coming out of the auger. If specific retailers are interested in that, then we can have a conversation with them too. But blenders are the most common practice. Mark asked, what's the herbicide in the formulation? I believe he's asking the specific herbicide for UltiGraz. Benny?
Yeah, so our recommendation is going to be DuraCore. There's a variety of benefits as it relates to DuraCore over some other products that we also do have labeled, but the key benefits would be broader spectrum control. So if you look at the DuraCore label, we have a tremendous amount of weeds on the label. There's some very troublesome, hard to control weed species that some of the other products don't get. So we really feel that DuraCore is probably the best fit. And the other thing about DuraCore is it's a general use product. And so whereas some of the other products may be restricted. So if you're a rancher that does not have a pesticide license in your state and you want to apply UltiGraz, you can do it with DuraCore, whereas if you did it with some of the other products, you may have to have a herbicide license or a pesticide license for you to make that application. DuraCore it's got 2 different active ingredients. That's what makes it a more broad spectrum, and so that's what our recommendations are for the UltiGraz system.
Yeah, very good, Benny. That's why we choose to use that DuraCore with UltiGraz. It's a good call up there. Will these products affect trees spread near trees in the pasture? Generally, we're going to be safe under a lot of trees, but it would be specific to the species. So you think about some of these species that are legumes, we're going to have activity on those. So that's a good question to refer to your range and pasture specialist. They will give you a more directed answer on, hey, what specific tree species do we need to watch out on the woodline? But majority of those were going to be safe underneath the drip edge. Another person asked, how are we calculating putting DuraCore on 200 pounds of fertilizer? Say that's what Benny was talking about. It's a process that we go through to say, all right, how do we put 20 fluid ounces on 200 pounds of fertilizer? That those folks, those UltiGraz dealers, know how to do that. They've got it calculated down to flow rates coming out. So it's not just, hey, we're dumping a jug and hoping for the best. That's why we have dedicated UltiGraz dealers. So you should know with confidence that we're putting 18, 20 ounces, whatever it may be, on 200 pound fertilizer, 250 pound of fertilizer, and we're getting good coverage, uniform coverage across the pasture. That kind of answers a couple of questions. What use rate and pounds of product suggested? That's going to be on that too. 20 ounces. We've got a minimum on fertilizer. Those UltiGraz dealers know that, but we want to make sure we got good uniform coverage of the fertilizer across the pasture to make sure we get good control. UltiGraz work on irrigated pastures? Yes, I would assume so. For sure. Benny talked about the importance of rainfall. So if we get a timely rainfall event through irrigation, then we're getting it into the soil and we're having that come across. Running up on time here. Right now, we had a couple questions about size. Right now that's going out in a blended bulk. We don't have lower size right now with bulk bags or 50-pound bags. This is coming out of the truck or wagons, dedicated equipment. If we didn't answer your questions, so we're right up on time. A couple of them I think were covered. Well, let me answer this one because I'd be remiss if not. There's a question also: is Duracor the one that is okay for white clover? Duracor is not the one that's okay for white clover. That would be UltiGraz herbicide, which is our new herbicide we launched last year in 2025, and that one is safe on white clover. So make sure that there is a difference between those two. UltiGraz is the herbicide that would be safe for white clover. Duracor is our broad spectrum residual activity herbicide. There. If we weren't able to answer questions, we're going to follow up with you. Thanks for putting those in the chat, and appreciate all your time. Benny, any last comments before we sign off here?
Yeah, just real quick. If for those of y'all that are interested in the UltiGraz product and learning a little bit more about some of those legumes that we can utilize this product with, we are actually hosting a webinar. Be looking out for some communication as it relates to these other webinars. We do have two webinars that are going to be coming up here sometime soon. I don't have the exact dates in front of me, but at the end of the day, we'll have a UltiGraz legume focused webinar, as well as a brush management webinar that we'll be hosting here in the next couple of months. So be looking for that. We'd love to have you again, and I appreciate everybody's time. Y'all have a good day.